about the wonder of 60,000 products in a grocery store being delivered to you fresh every day, coming from all around the world in thousands of grocery stores. Think about what's involved in just getting one store to operate well and not have everything spoiling on the shelves. And to get stuff there when it's fresh and edible. It's remarkable. This is not an unimportant, silly industry. It's probably the most important industry in the world. So here's how shopping in the United States evolved. So before the 1950s, there were downtowns. Before there were downtowns, there were rural crossroads, and at the crossroads there were general stores. And over time, as cities got bigger, general stores morphed into department stores. And that's what you see on the left, a 1940s era department store. If you wanted to buy stuff in the 1940s and 50s, you had to go downtown. What was the big downtown department store here that they're now building a building that's named after? Hudson's. Some of these department stores got as big as 900,000 square feet. And there's a name for them. The name for them is a term of art that if I hadn't learned from a friend of mine who's 80 years old and lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and started at JCPenney in 1966, I would never have been able to put this lecture together. They were called full-line department stores. And full-line department stores carried everything. If you go back and look at Sears, Sears once had a tagline that said, "Sears has everything." Anybody remember that? You guys are too young for that, but that was literally the tagline of Sears. Sears has everything. Sears was also the largest catalog company in the country back in the 1960s and 70s. It was the Walmart of its era. And there were well over 100, 150 independent department stores that were homegrown from all over the country. They were full-line department stores, and they had over 100 departments in most, literally the Walmarts of their day. And they were in downtowns, and when you go to the second picture, they became the backbones of the regional malls in the United States back in the 1960s. And what precipitated that? What caused us to build 3,000 malls? What didn't exist before those 3,000 malls were built? An interstate highway system. It was the building of the roads during the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s that created the mall era of shopping. Because once they started building roads, people could leave the cities. They could buy cheaper land, they could build bigger houses. Once they started leaving the cities, they needed the same services that were in the cities. And eventually you get to the modern grid you see today. And pretty much everything you see today in terms of roads and infrastructure didn't exist before 1955. So the shopping center industry is less than 75 years old. It's a very young industry. And we built 3,000 of those in the middle. And then starting, when I got into business in the mid-'80s, but actually before that, we started to build what you see on the right. Looks a lot different than a regional mall, right? Because what that is a power center or a modern day shopping center. And what each box in that shopping center, what does it represent that used to be in the mall, and particularly in the department store? Each store in there represents, except for a general merchandise store, except for Target or Walmart, each store represents what used to be a department in a department store. Those shopping centers deconstructed the department store.
Nick, couldn't you argue that even before the big boxes, the shop retail inside the mall was really the beginning of the deconstruction of the
Yes, that
department
was
store?
the beginning, so that gets a little bit into the weeds, but, so you had department stores, and then when the developers, and this gets a little complicated, but basically the way that a mall was built was, the department store picked where it wanted to go, they picked the developer. The developer gave them free land, money to open the store, and the right to own their own store. So if there were 3 department stores, each of them owned their own store. that all the developer got was everything between the stores. So they had a powerful incentive to build smaller stores, which is where they made their profit. And yes, they started to put in stores that had little pieces of what were in the department stores. And that is kind of the beginning of it, but it really got going when this model was adopted. We're the only country that has this model on the right, oops, as the backbone of its shopping system. And the reason for that is because we're the only country in the world that built the kind of road system we built and has free transferability of land and relatively unrestricted zoning. And I could spend a lot more time with you. I've taught in Egypt where the army owns all the land. And the only land that comes available for development is released by the army. And we can spend a lot more time. So that's how the department store started. That little thing, Golden Rule on the left, that's the original JCPenney store in Wyoming. Turned into that store. Sears has everything. Largest retailer in the world. And these are some of the really famous department stores around the country, but there were a couple hundred of them. Look how big they were. Look at Famous Bar, that's a St. Louis. It's probably an 800,000 square foot building. Sold everything. Probably ran the catalog from in there also. So we went from shopping downtown to out in the suburbs. We built those, right? We just went through that. And then it was killed by, I left something out. So, in 1959, a drugstore in Washington, D.C. was competing with another drugstore across the street. And the drugstore across the street, which is a small chain called People's Drug, today part of CVS, lowered the price on some vitamins. The vitamins came from a company called Parke-Davis. And the retailer across the street from People's Drug said, wait a minute, I can't let them do that. I'm going to drop the price lower. And when they dropped the price lower, what did Parke-Davis do? Cut them off. Because until 1960, suppliers of goods could vertically price fix. They could name the price that a retailer sold the product at. So if you bought a product from a supplier, they would have you sign an agreement that said you would sell it at X price. And everybody would sell it at the same price. The guy who ran a drugstore that got cut off by Parke-Davis is a man named Herbert Haft. He was my first boss in this business. I didn't even know that in law school I had studied the case in 1981, actually in 1979 in constitutional law. It was a seminal vertical price fixing case under the Sherman Act. And when the Supreme Court ruled in 1960 that Parke-Davis could not cut off the supply, it opened up the era of discounting. Without that case, you would never have had Walmart. Every product would be at a list price determined by the manufacturer. There'd be no such thing as a sale. And therefore, there would have been no reason to build something other than the mall. Because the reason they built the strip centers was to cut the costs. The idea was to cut the cost and increase the volume and make your profits up and increase volume. And the consumer benefited. And by the way, that case, it was overturned in a 5-4 decision by the conservative wing of the Supreme Court 7 years ago. And that's why if you go to Walmart today, you'll find products that are exactly the same price as at CVS and Walgreens, because there are certain products that they feel they have to carry where the manufacturer determines the price. You shouldn't be happy about that Supreme Court case. It's an anti-consumer decision that ultimately raises prices. Their logic was the illogic that consumers had enough choices. But of course, what choice do you have if you gotta buy a certain product and the manufacturer dictates to everyone it sells to that it has to sell at a certain price, and they can do that today. So Parke-Davis was overturned about 7 years ago. Without Parke-Davis, we wouldn't have had this. And with this, it caused that. And with that was a devastating influence on department stores.